Distance Learning Agenda. For today's lesson, we'll be completing the following steps. Number 1, objective breakdown. 2, content builder, where we will cover key ideas and terms for this lesson that will help you better understand the readings. Step 3, completion of the Unit 7.12 notes, World War II home fronts. In order to complete these notes, we will cycle through lectures and readings, and there will be some optional videos for you to watch in case you need some additional support. Step 4, completion of your electronic exit ticket, which you will turn in today for a grade. Notes Unit 7.12, World War II home fronts. Given various readings and lectures, students will be able to define the terms home front and total war, and recall how World War II affected the home fronts of Germany, US, Soviet Union, and Japan by completing an electronic exit ticket with at least 50% accuracy. If you haven't already done so, please take the time now to break down your objective. All right, before you're released to complete the notes, let's cover some key pieces of information. The first piece of information we're going to cover is how World War II was a total war. Now, in order to understand how World War II was a total war, we need to define the term total war. A total war is a war where governments are doing three things. The first thing governments do when they decide to make a war a total war is they decide that civilians need to be purposely killed. They believe that by attacking civilians of their enemy nation, they can crumble and destroy the hope and the will of their enemy to fight. Now, it's not enough to just destroy civilians. You have to also destroy their associated resources, meaning all of the things that civilians use to survive, such as churches, hospitals, schools, farms, etc. So civilians have to be purposely attacked and killed, and so do their associated resources. You also need to destroy their infrastructure, meaning their buildings, like their homes. And so during the total war, when governments decide to fight this way, they will focus on killing civilians, destroying their resources, and destroying their buildings. And attacking these things is seen as legitimate, is seen as correct and okay to do. The second thing about a total war is that when countries decide to make a war a total war, they mobilize, meaning they prepare all of the resources they have to fight that war. Doesn't matter what it is. If it's a resource that's helpful, they use it for the war. So for example, you might see a country who's fighting a total war. They might take their church, they'll clear out the church, and they'll turn it into an emergency hospital for wounded soldiers. Or they might take a school and they'll clear it out and they'll turn it into a factory to repair tanks. Or they might ask all of the soldiers to willingly give up their crops for free to feed the soldiers. That's an example of a country mobilizing, preparing all of its resources to fight a war. And that's something that countries do when they are in a total war. The last part of a total war is countries will give priority to winning the war, meaning that the most important thing on their agenda, their biggest focus, is just winning that war. Job security is not important, economic equality is not important, education is not important, medicine advancement is not important. The number one main thing is winning the war. Now, World War II was a total war because all of the countries involved in fighting decided to follow these three guidelines. Attacking civilians, their resources, and their buildings was seen as okay. Fully preparing all the country's resources to win the war was mandatory. And each country's main focus was only to win World War II. Now, specifically today, as we talk about how World War II was a total war, we're going to focus on how the United States, the Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan all mobilized, all prepared for World War II. And while preparing for World War II, which we know was a total war, we're going to find that each of these countries believed that every single one of their civilians was responsible for making sacrifices that would help the country win the war. It wasn't okay for someone to say, well, I'm going to keep living my normal life and I'm not really going to worry too much about my country winning the war. I have my own things going on. No. The governments expected and encouraged and pushed all citizens to somehow be involved in helping their country win, even if that meant personal sacrifices. Now, aside from being a total war, World War II also had some very important key differences from World War I. Let's talk about those. Unlike World War I, during World War II, civilians played a key role and were highly affected. World War I was pretty much mostly just the governments and the soldiers fighting each other from 1914 to 1918. Very different from World War II. During World War II, from 1939 to 1945, not only were governments and soldiers actively fighting in the war, civilians were also actively doing their part to help their country win. Now, because civilians were so highly involved and because they were also seen as targets, almost 20 million civilians died, most of these being children. One of the big reasons why civilian casualties were so high during World War II was because the countries fighting each other decided that the best way to get rid of civilians was bombing of the home front. Home front is a fancy way of saying where civilians live. You know that the front line is where fighting takes place. The front line is where the battle happens. The home front is the cities, the towns, the farms, the villages where people live. During World War II, each of the countries involved, unfortunately, strategically decided to bomb home fronts where innocent civilians were living. Why? Because these innocent civilians were somehow connected and doing something to try to help their country win World War II. Finally, during World War II, we're going to see some huge changes happen in the home front where the civilians live because of mobilization. Mobilization, meaning the preparation for war in the home front, in the cities, the villages, the towns, etc., preparing for war led to a lot of factories and job opportunities to be created where they didn't exist before. As a result of these new jobs and new factories in the home front, we're going to see a lot of immigration. People move to these home fronts. We're going to see a lot of racial tensions as different groups of people are being clustered together that aren't used to being together, that don't necessarily like each other. And we're going to see a huge change in women's roles as more and more men are sent off to fight the war, leaving the factories empty, requiring for women to step in and work in these factories for countries to have weapons. So for today's focus, we are going to be analyzing the home front. Specifically, you're going to focus on how World War II, which we know was a total war, which we know countries mobilized, meaning prepared for, we're going to see how World War II impacted and shaped the home front. The places where civilians lived, the cities, the villages, the towns, the farms, specifically in the countries of Soviet Union, United States, Germany, and Japan. Before you jump into reading your article on the Soviet Union, consider the following information. Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's surprise attack on the Soviet Union. We know that when he launched this surprise attack, he was breaking the non-aggression pact that he signed with Stalin. Now, specifically, when you read this first article and you learn about how the Soviet home front is being attacked by the Germans, you're going to read about two cities, Leningrad and Stalingrad. Leningrad and Stalingrad are some of the cities in the USSR home front that were attacked when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. When you're ready, jump into reading 1 to find out how the Soviet home front was impacted by World War II. Now that you're done completing the Soviet Union section of your notes, let's jump into the American home front. Before you start reading 2, consider the following. Isolationism, which we know is an attitude, led the United States to not physically join World War II until 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Now, even though the United States waited until 1941, keep in mind World War II was still taking place in the European and Pacific theater, especially because we know that in 1939, World War II is considered as officially starting when Hitler attacked Poland. This means that there are 2 years of World War II where the United States just kind of sat back and kind of watched from far away what was happening. Now, we also learned earlier in the unit that after the Battle of Britain, after Hitler tried to launch an attack against Great Britain, the United States got a little worried. The United States was worried that if Hitler tried to attack Britain again, the tiny island nation probably would not be able to defend itself and would most likely be conquered by Hitler this time around. Even though the United States doesn't want to physically get involved and send soldiers over to Europe to fight Hitler, they do decide to pass what's called the Lend-Lease Act. This was a law passed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt that allowed for the Americans to send medicine, military weapons, and any other materials Britain would need to continue fighting Hitler. Keep in mind, this does not allow the United States to send soldiers, it only allows the United States to send materials to the Allied powers. I'd like you to take a look over here on the right-hand side. We're going to see 3 images. These 3 images are going to show us the 3 different groups of people that you're going to be reading about in Article 2 when we look at the American home front. Specifically, you're going to be learning about African Americans in the United States and how they were affected during World War II while they were still in America, in the cities and the farms and the factories, etc. You're also going to learn about women, how women were affected. And at the bottom, it's kind of hard to see, but we're looking at here, we're looking at Japanese Americans. We're looking at American citizens who have Japanese background, Japanese ancestry. And you're going to learn about what happened to Japanese Americans in the American home front during World War II. All right, let's jump into the German home front. Before you start reading Reading 3, consider the following. Unlike the United States and Great Britain, Germany did not push or encourage women to work in industry, meaning factories, right away. That was something that they just didn't see as important, but eventually that mindset will change. But propaganda, meaning the brainwashing messages either via radio or posters or TV, the propaganda that Hitler dispersed and spread out through the German home front served to install nationalism, meaning pride within the German people, and the propaganda also served to keep morale, meaning German faith, high. The goal of this propaganda was to encourage people, be proud of their country, let's make Germany great again, this is why we're going to war, and hey, people are going to die, it's going to be hard, there's going to be sacrifice required, let's keep faith that we're going to win the war, let's keep pushing. Now, the propaganda that we just talked about in the previous slide is extremely important because a lot of the people in the German home front were alive during World War I. And therefore, they remembered how horrible and hard World War I was. They remembered the amount of sacrifices that they had to make. And they remembered what it felt like to make all those sacrifices and still lose the war. So the propaganda was important to try to convince the people this time around during World War II, it's going to be different. But Hitler was smart, and he knew propaganda was not enough to convince the people to jump into World War II. And so he decided that he did not want people to fear World War II. He didn't want people to fear the effects. He didn't want them to be afraid of their sons dying. He didn't want them to be afraid of their buildings being destroyed. He didn't want them to be afraid of the sacrifices they would have to make. So he tried to kind of keep them happy by giving them 2 things. The first thing is Hitler delayed certain economic military requirements and focuses. Now, we said that World War II is a total war, and we know that a total war requires for a nation to use all of its resources to win the war, meaning using church buildings, school buildings, farms, etc. Everything you've got, you basically use that only for the war. That's a big sacrifice because let's say that you are a school teacher and your school gets closed down to become a hospital. That's a pretty big change for you. That requires you to sacrifice. Or let's say you're a farmer and you are used to having your crops and selling your crops, but now your crops are being taken away from you to feed the military. That's a pretty big sacrifice. Or let's say that you are a parent and you are now being told that your 18-year-old son has to go enlist in the military to go fight World War II. You know they might die. That's a pretty big sacrifice. Hitler knew that these sacrifices would scare people and make people against World War II. So he decided to delay these. He decided to not force people to send their sons to war, to give up their crops, to allow for their schools and their churches to be turned into military buildings. He decided to not force them to do this. Why? Because he doesn't want to scare them. The second thing Hitler did was he decided to keep certain consumer goods available. Consumer goods are things that people use in everyday life, but you don't necessarily need them to live. It's just nice to have them. So, some examples of consumer goods would be makeup, music tapes, jewelry, TVs, bicycles. All those things are consumer goods. They're nice to have, but you don't need them to survive. During a total war, countries usually don't have consumer goods. Why? Because countries are focused on producing only weapons, machines, and technology that help them win the war. Hitler knows that when countries or when people are not allowed to have consumer goods, Hitler knows that people get upset. They feel like this is a huge sacrifice, and sometimes it makes people be against the war. As a result, Hitler decides to not take these things away from his people. He tries to find a way to allow his people to have consumer goods, but still ensure that the country's producing enough weapons, machines, and technology. By making these two changes right here, Hitler is hoping he can keep his people motivated to fight and support World War II. All right, let's jump into our last country, Japan, the home front. Before you start reading 4, consider the following. Japan believes in sacrificing everything to win World War II. That means that they believe that it is their duty, it is responsible, and it is required for the civilians and the soldiers to give everything in order to win the war, even if that means giving up their lives, their children's lives, their homes, their money. You do whatever it takes to help your country win. They are also very traditional and they refuse to use women in what they believe are male jobs. Because they're traditional, they believe that women belong in the home as the mothers, as the nurturers, as the creators of a clean, healthy, happy home with nutritious food. They are not okay with women leaving the home to go work in places where men should be working. All right, historians, great job on completing today's Unit 7.12 notes. When you're ready, jump into the exit ticket. I highly recommend you have the notes out in front of you and use them as you complete this show of mastery. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys next week on Tuesday since we do not have class tomorrow on Friday. Take care and see you guys soon.